So today I'm talking about experimentation, but as a brief starter, my name's Ella, I'm a data scientist here, and I'm currently working in the advertising team. But before that, I was based in the experimentation platform team, which is the background behind everything I'm going to be talking to you about today. I've been at Deliveroo for 3.5 years, but before that, I was working as an economist, which is also how I trained in my undergraduate and master's degree, and I was specifically working as an economist in academic research. So briefly going over what we'll cover today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about a couple of nuances of Deliveroo's business model and how that impacts data science and also impacts experiment design. And I'm going to talk about the experimentation platform vision. Next, I'm going to talk about the experimentation platform tooling and process briefly, so what the actual flow of that looks like. And then finally, I'm going to go over 3 key reflections of things that I find specifically quite interesting. So there is a bit of assumed knowledge for this presentation, which is that you know what an experiment is. But just very briefly, I'm going to give a 30-second intro to that. So assume that we have a standard burger graphic that everyone sees, and our designers have come up with a new impact burger graphic that they think is going to make everyone order more burgers. So we're interested in the question, what is the effect of switching from the standard graphic to the impact graphic on the number of burgers ordered? And to measure this, we're going to randomly assign the impact graphic to 50% of our user base and then compare the average number of burgers ordered. And through that random assignment, we're going to attribute any difference in burger ordering numbers to the impact graphic. That's all I'm going to talk about, actually, what A/B testing is. So Deliveroo's business model poses interesting challenges for experiment designs and analyses, and my first example of this is that Deliveroo is a 3-sided marketplace. So we have consumers connected to riders and restaurants through our network. And this means that whenever we're making changes, we also need to think about how, for example, a change to the rider network might impact consumers and restaurants. And this also has some quite strong implications for how we can do statistics. So, for example, what kind of randomization unit we can use, what kind of metrics we want to choose, and how we define those metrics. Secondly, our business is highly seasonal across days, weeks, and months. So often when we're talking about meal times, you can imagine there's quite strong seasonality in this. But similarly, you can imagine ordering behavior is quite different on a Monday evening versus a Friday or Sunday evening. So we have that kind of day and week seasonality. And then similarly, people's ordering behavior might change between winter and summer. And since we operate across many different countries, those months may not necessarily align across the year. So when designing an experiment, you need to make sure that it's kind of long enough to take into account the seasonality, but at the same time, effects might not necessarily be generalizable to different points in time and might change over time. And thirdly, some of our data is imbalanced and has a long tail, as shown on the graph. And what I mean by this is that, for example, we might have a smaller number of consumers who order very frequently, and then a larger number who order a lot less frequently. And this has implications for data science because, say, for example, we have a feature that we're really interested in the impact on our less frequent users. You're going to need to run that experiment for a lot longer period to make sure that you have a representative sample of these users as well. So next, I'm going to talk a bit about the vision, the experimentation platform. So the status quo before the XP platform was there was fairly little standardized process in how to run experiments. So there was different data analysis methods and fewer checks for unintended consequences because we had data scientists who kind of constructed a lot of this experimentation regressions and metric definition locally on their laptop. And that had a lot more difficulties with bugs. And there was relatively little democratization of experimentation, which is something I'm going to go into a bit more detail. So the 3 key pillars of the experimentation platform are quality, reducing cost, and democratization. So on quality, this comes a lot through standardization. So as many of you will know, doing a lot of data science work, there are many different ways that you can analyze and measure a very similar thing, and changing those methods, that can be preference. It doesn't necessarily mean one way is right or wrong, but changing those methods can have really big implications for changing the outcome of what you're measuring. So we want to know that over time, differences in measurement are attributable to differences in a feature, not necessarily because someone's defining something differently or someone's made their kind of regression model differently, unless it's kind of necessary or explicitly stated. And also on our XP platform, we can implement things like unit tests and kind of rigorous testing protocols that aren't really feasible for individuals to be doing. And additionally, we have a whole XP platform team that focuses on choosing the best statistical methods that fit this. So, they'll spend quite some time researching what is the most appropriate way to measure something. Similarly, on cost reduction, like the process that I described previously for people kind of running their own experiments does take a lot of time. So in standardization, we're hopefully reducing the amount of time needed to run these experiments and therefore reducing the cost of that. And also if you run experiments that go wrong or have bugs, that can be very costly. And thirdly, democratization, what we mean by that is that everyone should be able to test their ideas. So this is something we're still building on, but essentially that it's not just data scientists who are designing, running, owning, kind of disseminating experiment results. It means that non-data scientists are also able to set up and run their experiments. And we do have some non-data scientists running experiments currently at Deliveroo. But also through the tool, because we have a UI that other people can access, you can go and look at other people's experiments and have a standardized way of showing results. So this information becomes more accessible for people that are learning this, learning about experiments kind of afresh. So I'm briefly going to go over the flow of the experimentation platform we have. I'd say it's a pretty standard flow, but it does have quite a lot of bells and whistles, and we've emphasized features and built on features which we think are more important to our business model. So we have firstly experiment design, so that's standard hypothesis, experiment duration, randomization unit, and this auto-generates a power calculation based on what you input, and that'll impact the sample size you choose. So if your sample size is a function of time, which you'd expect for consumer experiments, that might impact how long you run the experiment for example. Next, we have metric construction, and that might seem quite obvious, but metric construction can be tricky, especially if you have as much data as we have. So you can construct metrics at like a request level or a session level, user level, restaurant level, geo level, et cetera, and you can have the same metric constructed in different ways. So for example, you might have user level order volume and restaurant level order volume, and those will be two very different things. Next, we have randomization. So we have a few different types of randomization we can do. I've mentioned consumer randomization, but there's other kind of geo-randomization, rider randomization. Next, we have monitoring. So for the kind of experimentation nerds here, some of this will be a bit more familiar. So sample ratio mismatch tests, variant switching, covariate balance. These are just tests we run whilst the experiment is live that's indicative of bugs or problems that there may be. And then finally is analysis and decision tracking. So I've mentioned how we kind of have analysis in a set way that's hopefully easier to digest for people over time. But to give a bit more detail on that, we have a smaller list of primary metrics. So hopefully 2 or 3 on average, and that's supposed to reflect your key decision criteria and trade-offs. And then we have a longer list of health metrics, which will hopefully defend against unintended consequences. So kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we have this 3-sided marketplace, and you might be working on a specific part of the consumer app, but you might also need to think about the impact on other sides, which are not in your primary metrics. Cool, so now my key reflections. We have first, this is actually one of our experimentation tenets, which I also wrote a blog post on. You can find that online. But so every experiment needs to start with a clear hypothesis and success criteria. This is, I think, an interesting one because, again, it seems obvious, but it can be difficult. So it's quite natural to think, okay, we've come up with this cool feature, let's just run an experiment and see what happens. But especially as a data scientist, I don't find that a very helpful way of looking at things, because if you force yourself to think beforehand through the channels through which you expect the feature to actually affect behavior and down into smaller detail, then you might end up kind of updating your prior belief about what you think is going to happen before you run the experiment. And the point of this really is to just improve the speed, especially after the experiment. So by doing this process, you can make an easier kind of rollout decision criteria, especially when you're weighing up trade-offs, things that might not be so clear-cut. And also as a data scientist, like most data scientists are involved in the design of features, but you might not necessarily be heavily involved, especially if it's design-driven or ML-driven. And at least this way, then you get kind of into the mindset more about what people were expecting to happen, and you can translate that into your analysis and what metrics you choose. The second one is only experiment when the value outweighs the cost. So this can be quite a contentious one, because I know some companies really think just experiment, but there's definitely some cases where experimentation isn't really suitable, so it's not free. Like, we do try to reduce the costs so much to an extent by kind of automating, standardizing, but it's not costless, and there's direct costs both in people's time, but also hidden costs in terms of the opportunity cost of experimenting on one thing but not another thing, or holding back something that could be a real game changer, but we are deciding to hold back and run an experiment on. And then another aspect is that some things don't really fit statistically into an experimentation framework. So some things like you can't randomize, some things you'd have to run for ages to get power on. Sometimes you might be implementing a treatment effect that's quite fuzzy in how it's implemented over time. And so perhaps you need some operations or some other kind of something to actually get the feature in place. It's not just changing UI. So that's that. And then finally, this is not one of our tenets, but something that I've been thinking about recently moving to product teams. So standardization plays an important role in the rigor-velocity trade-off. So it's quite interesting coming from academia. In my opinion, a lot of academic economic research specifically really overdoes the data analysis side of academia. So you'll run a million different regression specifications, look at loads of different metrics, look at loads of different cuts, and generally completely ignoring multiple comparison corrections. So I found it very refreshing coming to this kind of environment where you need to do things quicker. And that's not necessarily to say that you're doing things at a lower quality, but it does mean that you have to be quite clear-cut about what you expect to happen and what you want to measure. But on the flip side, not all approaches can be standardized. So you can standardize metric definitions, you can standardize kind of regression formula, but things like accounting for different trade-offs over time, at some point of the year, some things might be more important than others, and we can have a framework for how to kind of account for those differences. But you can standardize to an extent, but I think we're kind of reaching the threshold of where standardization becomes a bit more tricky, and then you're starting to create quite complicated decision frameworks. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to hear more about it, come chat to me in one of the breaks.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, very much. We're going to take a couple of quick questions, but you are going to stick around for the rest of the evening.
I am going to be here.
To be here, perfect. In terms of that, we're going to get you to run around, Lizzie. The mic can't be in two places at once, so can we have a show of hands if anyone has a question? Kick us off, Matt. Come on.
Thanks. You talked about kind of trying to reduce the costs and increase some of the velocity and make it simpler. What are some of the bits that you've not managed to solve? Where are still the problems? Where are the bottlenecks in getting experimentations run and full cycle?
That's a great question. So I think the key bottleneck is when generally in a space where it's not necessarily just low-hanging fruit and you're experimenting and everything's going up and everything's going up and everything's positive. It's like when you're in a space where now you've kind of reached the frontier and you're looking at trade-offs. And I'd say especially in areas where there's, in my opinion, more complex experimentation areas. So for example, we have a whole delivery organization which focuses on the network, and then anything involving network effects. You're kind of moving one thing and it's moving loads of other things as well. So I think that's quite specific to our business model, but I'd say a bottleneck is in kind of challenging rollout decisions and weighing up the pros and cons. Some things you can do easily if you can maybe quantify it into a financial value, and then, say if something's positive financially, perhaps that's good. But another thing is also thinking about the long run. That's something that's quite a challenge, is like, something impacts one thing in the long run, but you can't measure that in an experiment. You can only measure the short run impact, and then how do you go about weighing up those two things when they're both important?
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk. Reflecting on your academic experience, in your opinion, there was a time when businesses were simulating in order to see what would be the best way to change their processes, their products, their services. It feels like it's now called experimentation. Do you think there's a difference, or do you think it's a renaming?
Sorry, so that was, did you say simulating?
Simulation, yeah.
So I've not really used simulation much, unless it's like simulating fake data to look at how stats works. I'm guessing a bit about what you mean by simulation in a business context, but I guess it's kind of experimenting is a bit like dip your toe in. Does it work? Does it not work? Take a step back. Obviously, it's not simulation in the sense that it is really applied. Like, we do roll out changes in experiments to real people and real consumers and see how real behavior changes. I would assume with simulation that it's all like not actually applied in production to your users. I don't know.
Brilliant, thank you.
We'll take one more question and then you'll get peppered on the break.
Cool.
But you'll have a glass of wine.
Sounds good.
I'm going over here.
Thank you. You talked about the experimentation use cases being design and ML, but at the same time you said you're empowering non-data scientists to do experimentation here. So outside these two categories, what other form of experimentation has happened here? What type of use case other than ML and design?
Sorry, so you say outside of machine learning and design, what kind of features do we test, or what are the job roles where people are running experiments?
Oh, no, what other experiments, how can an experiment look like if it's not coming in form of comparing models or comparing features on a design space metric? I'm just trying to see, if I was working here, I want to do an experiment, but I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a software engineer. What type of experimentation can I do here with the data that you have?
So I'm not sure I'm exactly understanding the question. We have lots of different types of features. So obviously there's like machine learning features, design features, and then kind of data science features. We move things around in the app. We do promotions. These are all different types of features that we might test. In terms of who can then get involved in the design, running, execution of experiments, like this democratization angle, I think of as kind of an umbrella term for all different aspects of the experimentation pipeline. So at the moment, obviously, designers will be involved in the design of an experiment, but we also have designers who do experiment analysis, and I think that's more what I'm referring to in democratization. So, we have some designers who are really used to kind of A/B testing. They're familiar with the p-value, and they know their way around average treatment effects, for example. And I think that's more what I'm talking about when I think of democratization. But then there's also just this angle of kind of knowing enough that you're empowered to get involved in a discussion on the data science, typically data science technical side of things. And therefore that leading to better decision making, and also data science not being a bottleneck. Then you're not waiting for data scientists to make decisions because more people have the information to make those decisions.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ella. Can we have one more round of applause, please, for Ella? Thank you.